Mike Tyson, the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history, the man once known worldwide as the embodiment of absolute fear, and who earned more than $400 million from the most brutal fights, had it all before his life took a cruel and unforgiving turn. From an icon of power at the pinnacle of fame, Tyson slid into a collapse that unfolded publicly, slowly but inexorably. Prison was the first milestone, where the man who once believed himself invincible was stripped of freedom, reputation, and power, forced to confront a world where fists no longer held value. Behind bars, Tyson's image in society shattered just as much, as he was no longer seen as a great champion, but became a symbol of loss, of control, violence, and chaos, dissected by global media for every mistake, and turned into endless gossip. At the same time, the massive financial empire Tyson had built began to crumble. The luxurious mansions, supercars, exotic pets, and limitless spending that once demonstrated his power now became burdens. In 2003, Mike Tyson officially filed for bankruptcy with more than $23 million in debt, a staggering figure when compared to the hundreds of millions he had earned in the ring. Disastrous management deals, extravagant spending, the parasites around him, and his own lack of control drained everything, leaving a man empty in both money and faith. But all those losses still hadn't touched the deepest layer of the tragedy. The most devastating blow didn't come from boxing, nor from the law or the public's turning away, but from Tyson's private life, when he lost his young daughter Exodus in a heartbreaking accident. That death completely shattered what remained of the man inside him, because it was a pain that no title could soothe, no strength could withstand. In the face of that tragedy, every legend became meaningless. Mike Tyson, the man who once made opponents tremble with just a glance, stood powerless before the greatest loss of his life. With no ring to escape to, no money to shield him, no fear from others to cling to, he was forced to confront the cruelest paradox of his existence. The one who had been the world's fear couldn't protect himself or his family. This collapse wasn't a single moment, but the surface of a greater tragedy, where each event piled onto the others, signaling that behind that boxing legend was a painful story that still hasn't been fully told. The fall of Mike Tyson didn't come from one single misstep, nor from one isolated bad decision, but was the result of a chain of interconnected direct causes that accumulated and pushed him to a point of no return. Right from the moment he reached the top, Tyson began losing the most important thing without anyone noticing in time: the ability to control himself. In the ring, that loss of control was celebrated as killer instinct, as pure, unrelenting power. But outside the ring, it quickly turned into impulsive, hot-tempered, and dangerous behavior. Tyson reacted to the world with anger, because that was the only language he knew to protect himself. When there were no more fights to vent his rage, he turned to drugs and alcohol as a way to numb his emotions. Cocaine, stimulants, hard liquor, and a non-stop party lifestyle didn't just destroy Tyson's body, but also eroded his already fragile judgment. Addiction didn't come as a luxurious vice, but as a means of escape, to forget the growing emptiness and loneliness when fame no longer provided a sense of security. At the same time, violence began spreading beyond the ring. Fights, threats, aggressive behavior toward those around him became familiar headlines. Each time, Tyson's image was eroded a little more. No longer a champion, but a man unable to control his own instincts. The media, which had once exalted Tyson as a phenomenon, gradually turned against him. Headlines of praise were replaced by sensational stories, where Tyson was portrayed as a symbol of depravity and danger. The public no longer saw an exceptional fighter, but only a troubled man, a potential threat. But the tragedy didn't just come from Tyson himself or from the media. Surrounding him was a system of enablers, where no one truly said stop. Managers, friends, partners, and hangers-on all profited from Tyson's fame and money, and so they had no incentive to restrain him. Every boundary crossed was covered up, every mistake justified with money and influence. In a world where everything could be bought, Tyson never learned to take responsibility, only how to go further into loss of control. His marriage to Robin Givens became the public explosion of all those conflicts. For the first time, Tyson's private life was exposed to millions of Americans. The accusations, interviews, and television images turned that short marriage into a public trial, where Tyson was labeled a violent man, a monster behind the glamour. Though the story had many hidden sides, what couldn't be denied was that from that point, Tyson completely lost control of his own image. He was no longer the one telling his story, but became a character in the narrative built by the media. The pressure of public opinion, shame, and feeling betrayed pushed Tyson deeper into the spiral of self-destruction. When personal and legal troubles piled up, the money that had been a solid shield no longer worked. Huge spending, lawsuits, fines, compensations, and an unlimited lifestyle made Tyson's assets evaporate quickly. When he filed for bankruptcy, it wasn't just financial ruin, but the moment he realized the fame that had once brought every privilege had now become a burden. Every past mistake was dragged out and dissected, every failure exaggerated, and the name Mike Tyson no longer opened doors, but only brought prejudice and doubt. Looking back, none of the factors in this chain of tragedy were random. Loss of behavioral control, addiction, violence, the media turning away, and an enabling system were all linked like inseparable chains. The failed marriage, collapsed public image, and bankruptcy were just the outward manifestations of a process that had been happening quietly for a long time. This wasn't a sudden accident, nor an undeserved punishment from fate. It was the inevitable result of a man given too much power before learning to control himself. A tragedy formed step by step, silently but relentlessly, leading Mike Tyson to a fall that the world only saw when it was already too late. Brownsville, Brooklyn wasn't a place where a child grew up, but where a child learned to survive. When the story turns back here, all the pieces of the later collapse begin to emerge. Brownsville, during the years Mike Tyson was growing up, was one of the most violent neighborhoods in America, where police sirens, breaking glass, and screams in the night were familiar sounds. Crime wasn't something unusual, but part of everyday life. There, children weren't taught to dream, but forced to learn to dodge, endure, or fight back. The rules of survival were simple and brutal. Either you become fearsome, or you become a victim. Mike Tyson grew up in an environment where fists weren't just tools of violence, but the only language respected. Family didn't provide him the safety a child should have. Tyson's father disappeared completely from his life. No explanation, no presence, no role model to hold on to. That void was never filled, and it left in Tyson a lifelong feeling of abandonment. His mother, a sick and exhausted woman, loved her son in the way she could, but wasn't strong enough to protect him from the outside world. She struggled to survive, to raise her children in poverty, and in that fight, she couldn't shield Mike from the violence waiting around every corner. Home wasn't a refuge, but just a temporary stop before he had to step out and face the harsh reality. Tyson's childhood was shrouded in constant bullying. He was small, shy, and an easy target. The beatings didn't just come from older kids, but from other children also desperately trying to assert their place. Each time he was hit, each time he was humiliated, another layer of fear built up in Tyson. But that fear wasn't allowed to last long, because in Brownsville, fear meant weakness, and weakness meant being crushed. Very early, Tyson learned that to avoid being hurt, he had to make others fear him first. Violence, therefore, didn't come as a moral choice, but as a survival reflex. When Tyson fought back, when he used his fists to reclaim space for himself, he discovered something important. For the first time, the fear shifted from inside him to others. That feeling was both liberating and dangerous. It gave him something family and society never provided, a sense of control. But the price was steep. Each punch not only hurt others, but reinforced in Tyson a distorted belief that violence was the only way to survive and be respected. Gradually, the initial fear didn't disappear, but was buried deep, transformed into constant anger. That anger had no clear target, not directed at a specific person, but at the whole world. Tyson didn't just hate the bullies, he hated the circumstances that put him there, hated his mother's helplessness, hated his father's absence, and ultimately hated himself for being too weak to be born in a place like that. That self-hatred became the most dangerous psychological foundation. It made Tyson never feel good enough, no matter what heights he reached later. When a child grows up believing the world is the enemy and he himself is a mistake, then every later success is just a thin shell covering a deep insecurity. Brownsville taught Tyson there was no stopping point for violence, because violence never resolved fear at its root. It only temporarily pushed it back, only for the fear to return stronger. With no father to teach him how to control anger, no system to help him process trauma, Tyson grew up with a switch, always turned to maximum. Either fight or be swallowed. It was in that environment that the seeds of the baddest man on the planet were planted, not as a glorious symbol, but as the inevitable result of a childhood surrounded by fear, anger, and loneliness. Looking back from here, the later collapse is no longer hard to understand. Mike Tyson grew up never learning how to stop, because from the beginning, life never gave him a safe place to stop. Cus D'Amato appeared in Mike Tyson's life not as a magical cure, but as a strong hand grabbing a child drifting in chaos and pulling him into a new order that was harsh but clear. When Cus first saw Tyson, he didn't see a pitiful boy who needed comfort. He saw a raw block of energy, an unshaped anger, a fear without direction. Cus understood that if Tyson was left to continue living in that state, he would either be destroyed or become a destroyer of others in a meaningless way. For Cus, this wasn't a story about compassion, but about control. He believed that fear was the most powerful fuel in humans, and if directed properly, it could turn into absolute strength. Cus didn't try to soothe the wounds inside Tyson, didn't ask how much pain he had endured, didn't seek to heal the distorted childhood in Brownsville. Instead, he built a system where every emotion had to submit to one single goal: victory. Cus programmed Tyson with iron discipline, with grueling training sessions, with repeated lectures about fear, about power, about never being allowed to be weak. In Cus's world, boxing wasn't just a sport. It was the only escape for Tyson from the path of crime and self-destruction, but at the same time, it was the weapon for him to dominate the world that had once made him terrified. Cus taught Tyson that fear didn't need to disappear. It needed to be controlled. He turned the deep fear inside Tyson into targeted aggression, into the ability to overwhelm opponents from the very first glance. Tyson wasn't encouraged to understand himself, but trained to become a winning machine. Every day that passed, Cus reinforced in Tyson's mind one single message. This person's value was measured by absolute victory. Not a close victory, not a beautiful victory, but the complete destruction of the opponent. In the controlling embrace of Cus, Tyson felt safe for the first time. Not safe in the sense of being loved, but safe because there was structure, rules, someone deciding everything for him. Cus became the father Tyson had never had, but a father who didn't teach his son how to live with the world, but how to conquer it. Tyson depended on Cus not just in boxing, but in how he viewed himself. When Cus said Tyson was special, Tyson believed it. When Cus said Tyson was born to be a champion, Tyson clung to that belief like a lifeline. And because he had never learned to love himself, Tyson learned to love victory instead. Every precise punch, every fallen opponent, every cheer from the crowd became proof that he wasn't worthless, that the abandoned childhood wasn't entirely meaningless. But the cost of this salvation through control gradually became clear. By pouring Tyson's entire identity into boxing, Cus unintentionally stripped him of the ability to exist outside the ring. Tyson wasn't taught how to handle defeat, wasn't prepared for moments when strength wasn't enough to solve problems. In Cus's world, there was no plan B, either dominate or be destroyed. When Tyson stepped into the gym, everything was in order. But when he stepped out, the world was still chaotic as before, and he had no tools other than his fists to cope. Boxing became an escape from fear, but at the same time locked Tyson in a dangerous loop, where each victory pushed him further away from understanding who he was beyond being a fighter. Cus believed he was saving Tyson, and to some extent, he did. He pulled him off the streets, gave him purpose, discipline, and opportunity to rise. But that salvation was conditional, based entirely on maintaining absolute control. Tyson was protected as long as Cus was there to keep him in line. That dependence became so deep that Tyson didn't just need Cus to win, but to exist. Every belief, every decision, every boundary was placed in this man's hands, and in the process, Tyson never learned to set his own limits. His self-worth narrowed day by day until it was tied only to one thing: victory in the ring. Looking back, Cus D'Amato wasn't a villain, nor a saint. He was the one who gave Tyson the only path he believed was possible in those harsh circumstances. But by making boxing the absolute center of identity, Cus built a structure that was strong but fragile. It stood as long as there was control, a guide, consecutive victories. Once that pillar disappeared, the entire system Tyson relied on to exist would have no support. And then, the child born from fear in Brownsville, forged by control and victory, would have to face the world with no stopping point to hold on to. The death of Cus D'Amato wasn't loud, didn't happen in front of a crowd, no bell or lights. But for Mike Tyson, it was the moment the world collapsed in the quietest and cruelest way. The man who had held Tyson's hand and pulled him out of Brownsville, who had built the entire structure to control the anger, fear, and wild instincts inside him, suddenly vanished when Tyson was still too young to understand what was happening. Cus wasn't just a trainer. He was the only one who set boundaries for Tyson, the only one who dared to say no, the only one who understood that if not controlled, that power would turn back and destroy its own owner. When Cus died, Tyson didn't just lose a mentor, but lost the system keeping his life from derailing. No one could replace that role. The people around him were still there, but no one had the spiritual authority to restrain Tyson, nor the insight to realize that what he needed most right now wasn't freedom, but boundaries. In the void Cus left behind, Tyson was completely let loose for the first time, and that loosening quickly turned into chaos. No more iron discipline. No more training sessions controlled down to the detail. No more cold but firm voice reminding him of the consequences of negligence. Tyson stood alone before the world with enormous power, but no compass to guide him. That void didn't last long, because life doesn't allow emptiness to linger. It was quickly filled, not with healing, but with money, power, and instinct. Money poured into Tyson's life at a dizzying speed, faster than any maturity he could achieve. Lucrative contracts, huge bonuses, public adoration made Tyson believe he had escaped all limits. With no Cus to remind him that money wasn't a substitute for control, Tyson began using money as a tool to soothe unresolved insecurity. Everything could be bought, every trouble pushed aside with a check, and each time Tyson sank deeper into the illusion that he was invincible. Power swelled accordingly. In the ring, Tyson didn't just win, he destroyed. Outside the ring, fame made him the center of every room. No one dared object. No one dared question. And that silence was the most dangerous thing. Cus had once controlled Tyson with directed fear. But when Cus was gone, that fear didn't disappear. It just changed direction. Instead of fearing failure, Tyson began fearing weakness, fearing being looked down on, fearing returning to the helpless boy in Brownsville. To fight that fear, he relied on instinct, the thing that had helped him survive as a kid, but now no longer suited a man carrying so much power. Instinct took the place of reason, anger replaced discipline, and every impulsive act was reinforced by the fact that no one could or dared stop him. In a world without Cus, Tyson never learned to set his own boundaries, because he had never been taught that. Cus had been the living boundary, the wall keeping the storm inside Tyson from spilling out. When that wall collapsed, the storm met no obstacles. Tyson began living faster, harder, and more dangerously, as if trying to fill the void by pushing everything to the limit. Victory was no longer enough. He needed absolute domination to feel he still existed, and it was in this period that the seeds of every later tragedy began to sprout. Without Cus to remind him that power needed restraint, Tyson gradually lost the ability to distinguish between discipline and imposition, between confidence and arrogance. Every time he crossed a line without punishment, he learned another wrong lesson, that there were no consequences. But consequences didn't disappear, they were just delayed. Cus's death didn't immediately push Tyson into the abyss, but opened a long slide where every dangerous element was allowed to coexist. Money gave him the means, power gave him the silence of those around him, and instinct gave him the drive to act without thinking. Those three factors combined into an irresistible pull, taking Tyson further from the person Cus had tried to control. Looking back, the day his spiritual father died wasn't just a personal loss, but the root event of the entire tragedy. From that moment, Mike Tyson was no longer kept in check, no longer protected from himself, and no longer had anyone standing between him and the darkest parts of his own nature. Everything that happened later, though seeming like separate accidents, actually all stemmed from that moment, when a child forged by control was suddenly set free with power beyond his own ability to self-regulate. When Mike Tyson reached the pinnacle of boxing power at an age when many people still don't know who they are, the world witnessed an unprecedented phenomenon, but that very moment also marked the dangerous disconnect between power and maturity. Becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in history, Tyson didn't just win, he crushed opponents with speed, strength, and aggression that made the entire boxing world terrified. Fights ending in a few rounds, even a few minutes, created the feeling that no one could stand against him. Fame came too early, too fast, and too overwhelmingly for a person who had never been prepared to face it. Tyson stepped into the role of a legend when he himself was still a young man, carrying unresolved wounds, deep-buried fears from Brownsville, and an identity entirely dependent on victory. No time to learn how to lose, no space to understand who he was outside the ring. Tyson was swept into a whirlwind where each victory not only brought money and fame, but also reinforced an ego developing in a distorted direction. The world's fear became the mirror, reflecting his self-worth. When opponents trembled before stepping into the ring, when the media called him the most fearsome man on the planet, Tyson felt he finally had the power that childhood had refused to give him. But that power wasn't built on understanding or healthy confidence, but on others' fear. Every terrified glance, every comment praising his destructive strength, pushed Tyson further from self-reflection. He never learned to control himself because the world around him didn't encourage it. On the contrary, they rewarded loss of control with money, contracts, endless attention. Tyson lived in a space where every extreme behavior was justified if accompanied by victory. When he won quickly, no one asked how his mindset was prepared. When he appeared aggressive, it was seen as the mark of a champion. and when he crossed boundaries, the line between discipline and chaos became so blurred that even Tyson couldn't distinguish it anymore. Fame coming too early prevented him from maturing mentally. The lessons a person needs to learn through time, through failure, through taking responsibility, Tyson never had the chance to experience. He jumped straight from a violent childhood to supreme power in sports, skipping the entire phase of forming a healthy identity. The result was a person with the strength of a grown man, but a psyche still carrying many traits of the child who had been bullied and abandoned. Tyson reacted to pressure with anger, to insecurity with aggression, and to fear of being despised with absolute domination. The world's fear, instead of being seen as a temporary byproduct of success, became the main fuel enlarging his ego. Tyson began believing that if others didn't fear him, he would return to being that weak boy. So he didn't allow himself to slow down, didn't allow himself to appear vulnerable, and didn't allow anyone to get too close to see the cracks inside. In that dazzling spotlight, Tyson gradually isolated himself. Friends became beneficiaries. Those around him became yes men, and every relationship revolved around power and money. With no Cus to set limits, no voice authoritative enough to remind him that victory wasn't everything, Tyson drifted on his own momentum, believing the world only had two states: dominate or be dominated. His ego swelled with others' fear, but inside it was hollow. Each victory only brought short-lived satisfaction, followed immediately by emptiness needing to be filled with a bigger, faster, more brutal victory. It was a dangerous loop, where power was no longer a tool to achieve goals, but became the goal itself. Tyson didn't realize in time that while he was conquering the world, he was also losing the ability to understand himself. Fame coming too early didn't give him time to develop internal boundaries, and without internal boundaries, all external ones became fragile. The world's fear nourished a distorted ego, but didn't nurture the maturity needed to carry it. And it was in this phase of absolute power, but lacking maturity, that the foundation for greater tragedies was laid. Quietly but surely, waiting for the moment when power was no longer enough to hide the widening cracks inside the man Mike Tyson. When power reaches its peak, without accompanying inner maturity, Mike Tyson's life gradually slid into a state with no boundaries left. After becoming the youngest champion in history, everything around him opened wide, but no door led to balance. Drugs, alcohol, and sex didn't appear as frivolous pleasures of the rich, but as tools for Tyson to cope with himself. Cocaine helped him temporarily escape the insecurity and accumulated anger from childhood. Alcohol blurred the thoughts he didn't know how to handle. Sex became a way to affirm power, a means to feel desired and in control, even if just for a moment. The endless party nights weren't just indulgence, but escapes from the growing emptiness inside. In that world, no one truly dared to intervene. The people around Tyson, from friends and managers to those profiting from his fame, all had reasons to stay silent. Tyson's money and power created a false safe zone, where every behavior could be justified, every limit pushed back. Each time Tyson crossed a boundary without facing immediate consequences, he learned another wrong lesson: that no real limits existed. With no Cus to impose discipline, no voice strong enough to make him stop, Tyson lived in a space where any restraint was seen as weakness. Warnings, if any, were drowned out by cheers and material benefits. Violence, once confined to the ring and legitimized as part of the profession, began spilling into everyday life. Fights, threats, uncontrolled outbursts of anger became part of Tyson's image. He could no longer distinguish when to turn on the fight switch and when to turn it off. For Tyson, the world outside the ring also became a fight, where every interaction could be interpreted as a challenge. The only response he knew and trusted remained domination. But unlike boxing, real life had no clear rules, no rounds, no referee to stop the match when things went too far. Each act of violence outside the ring not only hurt others, but further etched Tyson's image as a dangerous, uncontrolled man. The media began noting these signs, but instead of becoming a wake-up call, they pushed Tyson deeper into the role he didn't know how to escape. The name Mike Tyson gradually became synonymous with chaos, and that very association made him believe he had to keep living up to that image, lest he face the emptiness inside. Tyson's self-destruction didn't happen overnight, but was a system built step by step. Drugs weakened his judgment. Alcohol blurred moral boundaries. Sex and partying distorted how he viewed relationships. Violence became the default reflex, and the silence of those around him became invisible complicity. Each element reinforced the others, forming a closed loop where Tyson grew further from the ability to self-regulate. He began spending money uncontrollably, not just for luxury, but because spending became a way to affirm he still had power. Reckless decisions, impulsive actions were all shielded by money and fame, so Tyson never had to pause and reflect. But deep down, the emptiness persisted, growing with each victory and each party. No one dared intervene, because intervening meant confronting a man both powerful and unpredictable. Advice, if given, was quickly brushed aside, as it threatened the invincible image the world was nurturing. Tyson gradually lived in a distorted reality, where he was both the center of all attention and the loneliest person in the room. That self-destruction was systemic, because it wasn't based on one single decision, but on a chain of small choices repeated in an environment without boundaries. Each day that passed, Tyson moved one step further from the person Cus had tried to control, and closer to a version even he didn't recognize. External boundaries gradually disappeared, but more dangerous was that internal boundaries had never been formed. Looking back at this period, it's clear that Tyson wasn't just enjoying power, he was gradually being swallowed by it. Drugs, alcohol, sex, and violence weren't the sole causes of the collapse, but manifestations of an inner war Tyson had never been taught how to win. In a life without boundaries, where everything was allowed until it was too late, Mike Tyson began destroying himself day by day, not because he wanted to fall, but because he knew no other way to exist in the role the world had assigned him. When life has no boundaries, Mike Tyson's collapse didn't just happen silently inside, but exploded in front of all American society like a public tragedy. The media, once the builders of the legend, the baddest man on the planet, now turned against him, making Tyson a negative symbol for everything America feared in a fallen star. What had been praised as killer instinct in the ring was now redefined as uncontrolled aggression. Impulsive behaviors in everyday life, which had existed before, were exaggerated, repeated, and rearranged into a consistent story of a dangerous, unreliable man. The media no longer asked why Tyson was like this. They just needed a strong enough image to represent the decay of unchecked power. Every newspaper page, every TV news segment added another layer of humiliation where Tyson was no longer a champion, but a cautionary example for the public. Social respect, which was fragile even at Tyson's peak, quickly vanished. Sponsors pulled out. Praise gave way to wariness and contempt. Tyson was no longer seen as an outstanding athlete, but as a problem to be managed, a potential threat to the image of sports and popular culture. In the public's eyes, he was no longer a person with history, with a traumatized childhood, but became a simplified symbol: violence, chaos, and loss of control. The fame that once opened every door now turned against him. Each time his name appeared in the press, it dragged along a chain of pre-framed prejudices. No chance to explain, no space for empathy. The public didn't want to hear about pain or context. They wanted an easy-to-digest story where the mighty fall and pay the price under the spotlight. This public humiliation didn't just damage Tyson's image, but stripped him of the last thing that could keep him connected to society: the feeling of belonging. He was pushed to the margins, both scrutinized for every move and denied recognition as a person capable of change. Each new mistake, even small, was viewed through the lens of old prejudices, making Tyson feel trapped in a role he couldn't escape. American media, in the pursuit of sensational stories, unintentionally or deliberately stripped away all human nuance from his image. Tyson became a symbol, but not of strength or resilience, but of depravity and moral failure. The irony was that the public's fear and curiosity continued to feed that spiral. Every article, every analysis show, every debate kept Tyson at the center of attention, but a punitive kind of attention. Fame, once a source of strength, now became an invisible cage, imprisoning him in the worst version of himself. The loss of social respect didn't just come from strangers, but seeped into close relationships. Tyson realized the looks directed at him had changed, from curiosity to caution, from admiration to judgment. He was no longer allowed to make mistakes like a normal person, because each error was seen as confirmation of the story society had decided to believe. In that context, fame was no longer an asset, but a burden weighing on every action and thought. Every step was watched, every word could be twisted, and every effort to change was met with doubt. This public shaming pushed Tyson deeper into isolation. When society turned its back, he withdrew further into his own world, where anger and self-destruction found reasons to exist. Instead of becoming motivation to fix things, collective humiliation reinforced the distorted belief that he was destined to be this way. And in that cruel loop, Mike Tyson not only lost society's respect, but stood at risk of losing forever the ability to see his own value beyond the labels the media had plastered on his life. Prison appeared in Mike Tyson's life not as an unexpected chapter, but as the inevitable endpoint of a path that had been sliding for a very long time. When the iron door closed behind him, everything that had defined Tyson in the world's eyes was immediately stripped away. No more spotlights, no more roaring crowds, no more power that made others fall silent just by entering the room. The prison sentence wasn't just legal punishment. It was the moment Tyson was completely laid bare, stripped of the layers that had shielded him for years. Money lost all meaning in a space where everyone wore the same clothes, ate the same portions, and lived by the same rigid schedule. Fame, which once made the world bow, now became useless, even dangerous, because it no longer brought privileges, but only made him a target of curious, envious, or challenging stares. Power, the thing Tyson had relied on to control his surroundings, vanished entirely. In prison, there was no place for the baddest man on the planet. There was only a numbered man, confined and forced to follow non-negotiable rules. It was in that space that Tyson first had to face himself without any distractions. No ring to prove his worth, no money to cover insecurity, no crowd to reflect his ego. That nakedness brought a profound psychological shock. Tyson fell into depression, not in a dramatic way, but quietly and corrosively. The long days in the cell forced him to think, and thinking became the most frightening thing. Every memory from Brownsville, from Cus, from the quick victories and chaotic nights began returning out of order, without explanation. Tyson faced a question he had never dared to ask. If there was no strength, no fame, then who was he? An identity crisis emerged, like spiritual hunger. He realized his entire life had been built around one single role, and when that role was taken away, he had no support. In prison, Tyson no longer experienced fear in the way he was used to. Fear now lay not in others' eyes, but in his own thoughts, in the sense of meaninglessness and emptiness. There were moments he realized the anger that had helped him survive out there no longer worked. It didn't open any doors, didn't bring respect, and didn't help him escape loneliness. On the contrary, Anger only drained him more in a space that didn't allow outbursts. The loss at this point was no longer symbolic, but very concrete. Tyson lost money, lost fame, lost power, but more importantly, he lost the story he had told himself for years. The story of an invincible man, of someone born to dominate, no longer held up against cold walls. Prison forced Tyson to slow down, to observe other people also stripped of everything, and to realize his pain was no longer unique. In that enforced silence, signs of self-questioning began to appear, though still weak and full of contradictions. Depression didn't turn Tyson into a gentle or instantly enlightened man. It made him exhausted, confused, and sometimes desperate. But that very state opened the possibility for the first time to see his own fragility without immediately trying to hide it. With no one to impress, no one to intimidate, Tyson began realizing that true power perhaps didn't lie in making others fear him, but in the ability to endure the truth about himself. Prison, in its cruel way, became the first place in Tyson's life where he couldn't escape. Each passing day was a lesson in limits, something he had never properly learned. Each night was a silent dialogue with himself, where questions were no longer drowned out by cheers or music. Stripped of everything, Tyson faced the only choice: either let his ego shatter completely or start rebuilding from zero. And though the path ahead was still unclear, it was in prison that for the first time, Mike Tyson was no longer defined by the world's fear, but forced to confront his real self, naked, vulnerable, and full of contradictions, yet the only person capable of changing the fate he had created with his own hands. When Mike Tyson left prison and stepped back into the ring lights, it wasn't the return of a legend, but the appearance of a man broken from within. The world still remembered the old power, still expected knockout punches and the gaze that made opponents tremble. But this Tyson was different. His body was still there. The muscles forged through thousands of training hours still carried the shape of a warrior. But the spirit that had turned that body into a weapon of destruction was no longer intact. Returning to the ring after incarceration, Tyson carried the expectation that boxing would once again redeem him, that the opening bell would erase the years of lost identity. But from the very first steps, he realized something had irreversibly changed. The ring had once been where he found order in chaos, where anger was controlled and transformed into victory. Now it was just a space reminding him of the past, where each punch no longer carried the meaning of release, but only reminded him of what was lost. Tyson still won the early fights, still had explosive moments that made audiences believe Iron Mike was back, but inside, he felt hollow. Victory no longer brought security or confirmation of self-worth. It was just a weary repetition of an old role, while the person inside had changed. The years in prison had exposed Tyson's ego, making it impossible to return to the unconscious state that had allowed him to dominate. Each time he entered the ring, he was no longer fearless, but a man acutely aware of his own fragility. That very awareness weakened what had been his greatest strength. Boxing was no longer redemption, because it could no longer hide the inner cracks. Tyson realized that what he had called killer instinct was actually nurtured by fear and control, both eroded over time. With no Cus to guide him, no illusion of invincibility, he entered each fight with a mental burden his body couldn't carry for him. This difference became clear when Tyson faced opponents who no longer feared him as before. They saw a man who could be beaten, and that look unsettled him. He was no longer fighting to dominate, but to find himself, and that was a harder battle than any match. Boxing, once the place where everything was resolved by clear rules, was no longer enough to heal deeper wounds. Each punch he threw couldn't dispel the sense of loss. Each victory couldn't fill the ego void. Returning to the ring, Tyson also had to face the reality that the world had changed. Boxing no longer revolved around him, and he was no longer the center of collective fear. Media attention carried more skepticism than celebration, and each stumble was seen as proof of inevitable decline. In that context, Tyson gradually understood he couldn't go back to being the man of the past, even if his body was still strong enough to fight. This comeback was therefore tragic. It wasn't a journey of rebirth, but a desperate effort to cling to a shattered identity. Boxing no longer redeemed, because what Tyson needed now wasn't another victory, but a way to exist not based on violence and others' fear. But that path was still unclear, and each time he stepped down from the ring, Tyson felt more clearly that he was fighting his own shadow. Returning as a damaged man, Mike Tyson was no longer a symbol of absolute strength, but living proof of the price paid when power comes before maturity and when a person is forced to face the truth that what once saved him is no longer enough to hold him together. The night facing Evander Holyfield wasn't just a boxing match, but the moment Mike Tyson reached the deepest bottom of his life's tragedy in front of the world's gaze. Everything leading to that night carried the shape of fate. Tyson entered the rematch with an enormous mental burden: the prison past, declining form, his own shadow, and the obsession to prove he was still Mike Tyson. Holyfield wasn't just an opponent, he was a mirror, reflecting what Tyson had lost: discipline, calm, and the ability to control himself in the harshest moments. From the early rounds, Tyson felt clearly that this fight was no longer in his control. Each collision, each clinch, stirred up anger accumulated over years. Anger no longer guided by Cus, no longer restrained by discipline, but just waiting for a chance to erupt. In that chaotic moment, when Tyson bit Holyfield's ear, time seemed to freeze. It wasn't a tactical move, not a sports reflex, but a pure act of collapse. In front of millions of viewers, in front of global television cameras, Mike Tyson single-handedly destroyed what remained of his public image. That moment didn't just shock the boxing world. It marked a point of no return in his life. The earbite wasn't merely a rule violation. It was the naked exposure of a man who had lost the ability to control himself in the most critical moment. All efforts to return, all hopes for redemption, all stories of rebirth were erased in those few seconds. The media no longer saw Tyson as a tragedy needing understanding, but as a symbol of complete downfall. Slow-motion replays, sensational headlines, endless debates turned that moment into an indelible stain. Tyson's public dignity was crushed right in the ring, the place that had once been his sanctuary. From then on, every mention of Mike Tyson started with the ear bite, overshadowing all previous achievements and efforts. The most painful part wasn't the penalty or condemnation, but Tyson realizing he had confirmed every negative stereotype the world had attached to him. In that moment of lost control, Tyson not only hurt his opponent, but stripped himself of the right to be seen as a complex person, capable of mistakes and correction. That night ended not just a fight, but an era, ending the illusion that boxing could still redeem him. When Tyson left the ring in chaos, he carried the heavy silence of a man who understood he had just crossed the final line. No way back to the image of a respected champion, no space for public forgiveness. The baddest man on the planet had turned himself into a symbol of self-destruction before the whole world. That was the night everything ended. Belief, respect, and the ability to be seen beyond the darkest moment of his life. And from that point of no return, Mike Tyson was forced to move forward not as a legend seeking glory again, but as a man who had lost everything, facing the most painful question: whether anything could be rebuilt after single-handedly destroying his own public dignity. After the fateful ear-biting night, Mike Tyson's life entered a phase even harsher than defeat in the ring: complete bankruptcy, not just financially, but spiritually. Penalties, compensations, legal fees, and a chain of uncontrolled financial decisions quickly strangled the fortune once seen as endless. The huge sums that had given a sense of invincibility now became debts weighing heavily on every waking day. Financial bankruptcy didn't come like a thunderbolt, but like water, slowly draining away, leaving a barren bottom. But what was more painful was the spiritual emptiness. When money was gone, Tyson discovered that the relationships once surrounding him vanished faster than any contract. Loneliness emerged naked, no longer covered by glamour or power. Fame, once a protective shield, now became a burden from the past, a memory constantly dragged out to compare with the poor and crumbling present. Each public appearance, Tyson wasn't seen as a man trying to get back up, but as a symbol of downfall to satisfy curiosity. The name Mike Tyson carried images he couldn't erase: violence, chaos, failure. In that context, losing money was just the surface. The core was that he lost faith that he still had value without victories to offer. Bankruptcy forced Tyson to face a bitter truth. Fame couldn't nourish the soul, and a glorious past didn't guarantee the future. Memories of the peak now became a burden, because they constantly reminded him of the unbridgeable gap between who he once was and who he now existed as. Spiritual emptiness left Tyson lost, not knowing what to cling to when all familiar measures collapsed. He realized he had lived too long, relying on external things to define himself, and when those vanished, he had no language to speak about himself. In that poverty, both material and spiritual, Tyson was forced to face the hardest question: whether a person could continue living when every symbol that had supported him had become a burden. And it was from the deepest bottom of this complete bankruptcy that the seeds of a different search, slower and more painful, began to form. The death of his daughter was the final blow, cruel and non-negotiable, striking directly at what remained in Mike Tyson that he had tried for years to keep intact. If financial bankruptcy left him naked before life, this loss tore away the last spiritual defense. No longer professional failure, no longer collapsed fame or evaporated money. This was the most primal pain of a human being, the pain of a father powerless before fate. Tyson collapsed completely, not in the loud way of party nights or explosive anger, but quietly, hollowly, and enduringly. Everything that had kept him standing, strength, aggression, endurance, became meaningless before the unfillable void. Memories of his daughter became an obsessive pulse in every day, every night, making time no longer flow forward, but only spiral in pain. In this period, Tyson had nothing left to hold on to. Boxing had betrayed him long ago. Fame was a heavy shadow. Money was gone to buy oblivion. Dissolved relationships weren't strong enough to support a pain beyond familiar measures. Suicidal thoughts appeared not as dramatic tragedy, but as a cold, weary question. If nothing was left to hold on to, then what was the point of existing? That was the deepest breaking point, where every language of getting back up became empty. Tyson realized that his whole life he had fought the world with fists, but before this loss, there was no fight to enter, no opponent to face, no victory to reclaim, only silence. And in that silence, the ego that had dominated was eroded to the core. He felt he had reached the end of the road, not the road of fame, but the road of endurance. No Cus to set limits, no public to expect from, no illusion of redemption to cling to. This was the most painful exodus, leaving behind what had defined him, not to reach a better place, but because there was nowhere else to stand. And it was at that point, of having nothing to hold on to, that Mike Tyson faced the nakedest truth about himself: a broken father, a person stripped of all familiar tools to exist. The tragedy was no longer something happening outside. It became a permanent inner state. From here, if there was still a path, it couldn't be one of strength or domination anymore. It could only begin with acknowledging absolute fragility, that there are pains that can't be defeated, only lived with, day by day, with a weak but honest will. After reaching the deepest breaking point of loss, Mike Tyson didn't enter a cinematic journey of rebirth. No dazzling awakening moment or one single decision changing everything. What awaited him on the other side of tragedy was only a prolonged and heavy reality, living with trauma. Post-trauma didn't come like a fierce storm that then vanished, but like a toxic fog covering every day. Memories of violence from Brownsville, from the ring, from prison, and from his own moments of lost control returned in no order. They appeared in sleep, in sudden silences, in unexplained tension. Tyson turned to addiction as a familiar reflex, not for pleasure, but to silence memories that wouldn't stay quiet. Recovery came as a desperate effort to regain minimal control over life, but it was never a straight line. Each recovery was facing naked truth, and each relapse a painful reminder that trauma doesn't vanish just because of will. Tyson lived in a loop of fragile hope and familiar disappointment, where each step forward risked 2 steps back. He began facing violent memories, no longer by denying or boasting, but by weary acknowledgement that what he had done and endured had left indelible marks. No miracle here, no moment of complete healing. Just days, Tyson tried to wake up, accepting that anger was still there, pain was still there, but he didn't necessarily have to let them control every action. Change, if any, happened slowly and uncertainly, sometimes only shown in stopping sooner before self-destruction. Living with trauma meant accepting the past couldn't be erased, only carried in a less destructive way. Tyson gradually understood that new strength didn't lie in dominating or defeating, but in the ability to stay with pain without running away. It wasn't a resounding victory, but a humble existence, where each day passing without self-destruction was a considerable effort. No miracle, just painful honesty with himself. And in that honesty, Mike Tyson learned to keep living, not as a redeemed legend, but as a man full of scars, trying not to let them continue defining the rest of his life. The journey of Mike Tyson ends not with a final victory, nor with the complete redemption the public often expects in stories of fall and rise. It ends in a quieter, more painful, and truer state. Looking from this endpoint, everything seems to return to where it began. A deeply wounded child, growing up in fear, carrying anger as the only armor to survive. Brownsville created the fear. Cus D'Amato turned that fear into a weapon, and the world exalted that weapon until it turned back to destroy its owner. Mike Tyson became a legend not because he was healed, but because he never was. His entire illustrious career was built on a cracked foundation, where victories covered wounds, where power substituted for maturity, and where fame was used to delay facing himself. No perfect atonement moment here, no symbolic final fight to erase the past. What Tyson did, what he lost, and what he destroyed can't be washed away by time or apologies. The bite on Holyfield doesn't vanish from collective memory. The years of self-destruction, broken relationships, harms left on others can't be rewritten into a beautiful ending. And that's why this story doesn't end in victory, but in truth. The truth that Mike Tyson wasn't a pure demon, nor a noble, tragic hero. He was a person placed too early into power without being equipped to carry it. He was the child who never had a stopping point, growing into a man who didn't know how to set his own limits, and finally becoming a symbol of the price paid when strength comes before understanding. Awakening came to Tyson very late, when most everything was lost. It didn't come as redeeming light, but as a heavy realization that there was nothing left to escape from. In the later years of this journey, Tyson no longer tried to convince the world he had completely changed. He only acknowledged that he had lived, erred, broken, and had to carry those scars for the rest of his life. The remaining dignity of Mike Tyson doesn't lie in titles, nor in public forgiveness. It lies in no longer denying the truth about himself. No more boasting, no more illusions, no more turning himself into victim or monster. Just a person accepting that the past can't be fixed, but can be looked at straight. That is a humble, fragile dignity, but the only thing not taken away after everything. The tragic fate of Mike Tyson is therefore not a story of missed redemption, but a story of the cost of a life unhealed. A wounded child became a legend, but that legend never learned how to live as an ordinary person. No final victory awaits here, only a belated awakening and a naked truth. Sometimes, the bravest thing isn't getting up to win again, but continuing to live with what is broken, without hiding, without prettying it up, and without lying to oneself anymore. When looking back at the entire tragedy of Mike Tyson, the overwhelming feeling is not judgment, but a profound sadness and compassion for a person who was never truly healed. From the boy in Brownsville growing up in violence, bullied and surviving with his fists, Tyson carried fear and anger as survival instincts. Cus D'Amato didn't heal him, but controlled and programmed him for absolute victory, turning boxing into the only escape and also a psychological prison. When Cus died, the final boundary disappeared. Money, power, and instinct filled the void, opening a life without limits with drugs, alcohol, violence, and the enabling of the system around him. American media once exalted him, then turned away, turning him into a negative symbol, stripping away social respect. Prison stripped everything bare: money, fame, power, pushing Tyson into depression and an identity crisis. Returning to the ring with the body still there but the spirit broken, boxing was no longer redemption. The night biting Holyfield's ear was the point of no return, the moment of self-destruction before the whole world, where public dignity was crushed. Financial bankruptcy followed spiritual emptiness. Fame became a burden, and the final blow, the death of his daughter, pushed him to the brink of suicide, where there was nothing left to hold on to. Yet, the fact that Tyson continued living with trauma, facing violent memories, recovering then relapsing, and accepting that there is no miracle, is the most human part of the story. The lesson for the American people lies here. Strength, money, and fame cannot replace spiritual maturity. Power that comes early without limits will betray itself, and a society that only knows how to exalt, then humiliate, will miss the chance to heal. Honoring Tyson is not by erasing mistakes, but by looking straight at the truth, to remind each other that investing in mental health care, setting moral boundaries, and daring to intervene at the right time is the path to prevent tragedies from repeating. If the tragic but truthful story of Mike Tyson makes you reflect on the price of fame and unhealed power, please subscribe to the channel to join us in the next profound journeys. Thank you for listening to the very end. See you again in the next video with another story where truth and human dignity are always placed first.